Hello and welcome. My name is Angela Davis and I'm the Foreign Quilter. And this is part 2 of Beginner Basics. Wow, I have so much that I'm going to be sharing with you today and I'm so excited. And this is what we're going to be completing today. And there's a lot of information to absorb. So I suggest you get a notebook and a pen and a pencil, and at different intervals, pause and take notes. This way you have things written down that you can refer back to, okay? I'm going to start you with, okay, let's back up a minute. Beginner Basics sounds really dull, doesn't it? And it can be, I'm not going to lie to you. It can be very dry content. Because I'm going to be going over a lot of new vocabulary with you. What's a quarter and seam allowance? What's a presser foot? What is tension on your machine? All of those things. What is stitches per inch? Okay? All of those things you're going to be learning in this video. And the reason why they're so important, okay? What I've learned over the last week since I put out, well, it's been only a few days since I put out the first video, was that some of my viewers expressed that their first experiences with quilting, their teachers didn't go over the foundation, the basics, okay? So those students were left leaving the classroom frustrated, disappointed, not excited at all about working on their project, okay? Quilting is so exciting, okay? And it's so much fun, okay? And I'm going to be part of that, okay? So, why did I say all that? I had a couple of great teachers way back when that taught us the foundation, the very basics, okay? Without those basics, it's impossible to move forward on your journey and get excited. Once you have the basics, you can apply that to so many other areas in quilting, okay? All you need are the basics. Now, what about me? I consider myself an intermediate quilter. I don't consider myself an advanced quilter. Is there room for learning? Absolutely. There always is. And never stop learning, okay? But what I love about the basics is that it's like building a house. If the house isn't built on a strong foundation, the walls won't stay upright. The roof won't stay upright, okay? If you have a strong foundation, everything else comes together smoothly, all right? And I want to be a part of that for you, okay? When those viewers reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I didn't have such a good experience, okay? That makes me sad, all right? Because it is exciting, okay, to learn. With all that being said, it's not a short video, okay? There's a lot to learn. It's approximately an hour long, okay? But if you were in a classroom with students and a teacher, it would be an hour-long class, or maybe 2 hours, or maybe 3, okay? So my suggestion is get a notebook and label it, The Foreign Quilter Part 2 Beginner Basics. This way you have something to refer back on. Okay, in case you're looking at your notes a year from now and going, now which video did I watch? Who was that? They taught me this, okay? You can go back to it, okay? So with that being said, let's dive right in. Good morning and welcome. Do you have your favorite beverage? Coffee, hot tea, you know, frothy drink that you mix up in the blender, get it ready. Because This is part 2 of Beginner Basics, and my name is Angela Davis, and I'm the flooring. So the first thing I want to do is I want to recap a few things that I went over in part 1. We talked about the finished sides of a piece in a quilt. The finished sides are, what do you want that piece to measure once it's sewn into the block or the quilt? So for example, the quilt that we're going to be making, we want the finished size to be 4 inches, okay? In this little block, it's 2 inches, okay? We also talked about what's a seam allowance. The seam allowance is the distance between the stitching line and the end raw edge of the fabric. That distance right there is called a seam allowance. And the seam allowance is put in so that as you wear your clothes or you use your quilt and you wash it and use it again, this part doesn't fray completely away, okay? If we had the seam right up near the edge, it would get frayed and that seam would just pull right apart. That's called seam allowance. And seam allowance is different in quilt making than it is in making clothes. Depends on what it is you're making and other areas of sewing, okay? So generally in quilt making, we use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? Now, we talked about cutting tools. You're at the store, you are buying your basic beginner items to start making a quilt. I don't know about you, but that's intimidating, okay? It's very intimidating because there are so many different types of tools, so many different types of rulers, and so many different sizes of mats. Your mat, it's called a self-healing mat. A good size to get for a beginner is 18 inches by 24 inches. That's a nice standard size. That's the size I used for the first 15 years that I made quilts. I completely wore it out, literally. I bought another one, same size, and then probably a couple of years later, I graduated to the next size up, which is 24 inches by 36. One standard size will do. I would not buy anything smaller than 18 inches by 24. What size ruler do you need? I started out with 6 inches by 12 inches. I did, however, probably within a year, I moved up to the 12.5 by 12.5 because when you're working with larger blocks like the one that we're going to be doing in this particular quilt, this one gives you a broader range of size when you're measuring. So I would say you can start out with this one, but if you want to skip this one and go straight to the 12.5 by 12.5, that's fine. But buy one. You don't need to buy 10, okay? There's a lot of rulers out there and they're expensive. And then within a year of quilting, I bought this one. It's 5 by 5. The reason why I like this, see that line right there? That's my 45-degree line. And this is great for trimming down half square triangles, okay? So, you don't need 10 different rulers. You don't need 3 or 4 different cutting mats, okay? The other thing you need is a rotary cutter. 45 millimeter is a standard size, okay? You don't need the 60 millimeter and you don't need the little mini one. This is a standard size. I have had this since 1999. Okay. The only thing that I purchase to replace are the blades. Okay. That's all you need. That's all you need. Now, Scissors. I suggest a regular pair of snip scissors for snipping threads, and I suggest one good pair of scissors that you will use only to cut fabric, okay? When I was young, they called these shears, okay? They're scissors. They come in different lengths. They come with different handles, okay? This one, from tip to the edge of the handle is 8 inches. So from edge of the handle to the tip is 8 inches, okay? Now, if you have issues with arthritis, if you have issues with being able to grip tightly, and we all have different things we're all at different stages in our lives, and we all have different things that can limit us but not hinder us from doing what we enjoy, okay? They sell scissors with a spring release so that every time you cut, it releases. It has a spring built in there to help alleviate the tendons in your hand, okay? So you want to look into something like that. They also make rotary blades, cutters, that they have extra grips on them to help give you a more comfortable grip, okay, when using this. If you are not comfortable using it the way it is, okay, I'm going to show you a picture in the video where the ruler and the cutter are one unit, so that when you cut, instead of gripping like this, you're using the palm of your hand and you're pushing and gliding the rotary unit across the ruler. So if you cannot get a firm grip, all you have to use is the palm of your hand to push, all right? I'm going to leave a picture of that in the video. It may cost you a little bit more, but you're getting both in one unit. You're getting the grid and the rotary blade are built into one another, okay? Now, the other thing I want to talk about is your sewing machine, okay? Now I have to have my coffee. Your sewing machine is yours, okay? When was the last time you read the manual? There is a lot of information about your machine in the manual that maybe you've been sewing for a little bit that you've overlooked, or maybe you're brand new to the machine and you're thinking, oh my gosh, where do I start? Read the manual first a couple of times, get comfortable with it. Learn how to set up the foot pedal, the power cord. Learn the basic settings you want to think about are stitch length. What is stitch length? Stitch length is the number of stitches per inch, okay, when you're sewing the seam. So I'm going to move my camera right here. On my machine, I have a Bernina. My manufacturer setting is set at a number 2, okay? So here's my stitching line, and between this line and this line is a pen mark. That's exactly 1 inch. So how many stitches per inch is my setting number 2 on my Bernina? There's 14 stitches in a 1 inch section of stitching line, in a row of stitching line, okay? That's stitches per inch. Now, the older machines will actually have a knob or a lever where it'll say numbers like 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 18. They actually put the stitches per inch on the lever because on a lot of the older machines, that was the best way to identify what that lever was for, or maybe it's a knob, okay? That's 14 stitches per inch. That's a very tight stitch. On my setting on a Bernina, the number 2.5 setting is 12 stitches per inch, okay? And then right here, the number 3 setting on my Bernina is 10 stitches per inch. Now, why is this important to know? I was taught the smaller the stitch, the tighter the seam, okay? And that's true. The looser the stitch, the looser the seam, it will come apart more quickly, but looser stitches are there in situations where you want the stitches to be temporary so that you can take them out later. So for example, this is a number 4 on my setting. This is 6 stitches per inch. This is a basting stitch, okay? A basting stitch is used when you temporarily want to hold pieces together until you put the permanent stitches in that particular piece, okay? It's used a lot in garment sewing. We do basting stitches when we layer our quilt sandwich together, but that's in a future video, okay? So why am I telling you this now? I like to use somewhere, but now my machine, I can go between a 2.5 and a 3, okay? Because it's a computerized model, all right? So I can go between 10 stitches per inch and 12 stitches per inch. 10 and 12 is a good standard stitches to do when you're quilting the piecing, okay? This right here, okay, this is a 4 patch, it's a smaller version. Putting the pieces together and quilting is called piecing. So when you're piecing our stitches, our squares together to create the quilt top, you want to set your stitch length somewhere between a 10 and a 12, okay? That way they're permanent enough to keep a nice tight stitch, but yet loose enough where if you make a mistake, it's easy to rip out. If you do anything 14 or tighter, because I've done 16 stitches to the inch as well, that's a very tight seam, but it's also very difficult to rip out if you make a mistake. So I would suggest setting your machine at about a 10 or 12 stitches per inch when you're doing your piecing, putting the quilt together. Okay, so this is part 2 of Beginner Basics, okay? Get to know your machine, get to know your settings on your machine for stitches per inch for the piecing of your machine. Now, there is such a thing as, oh God, what's it called? The tension on your top thread and your bobbin thread. The tension is how the top thread and the bobbin thread interlock to create an even flat seam, okay? The bobbin tension should be set automatically by your manufacturer when you purchase it, okay? The top tension will have a knob somewhere along the top or the side or the front where you can adjust the top tension depending on how thick your fabric is, how delicate your fabric is, and so on and so forth. That affects you a lot when you're making clothing in garment sewing. We're making quilts. So the standard setting for your top tension on your top thread should be whatever the manufacturer's setting is for your machine. And again, you need to read your manual for that, and it will tell you what the standard tension is, okay? If your tension is off, you're going to get extra loops along the bottom or the top of your piecing, okay? Where's my little square? See how flat that seam is? It's hard to see. But my seams lay nice and flat. My threads lay flat. You don't see any loose loops on the front or the back. That means my tension is set correctly on my machine. And again, read your manual and it will tell you what the regular tension is for your machine. Quilters, we use basic quilting, we use 100% cotton. Now, there are quilters out there that do a lot of creative art quilts. They will use different types of fabrics in their particular quilts. They may have to adjust their top and bottom tension to accommodate those fabrics. I'm not going there yet. This is basic techniques. We're using 100% cotton, so we don't have to touch the tension on the top and bottom because we're going to use whatever the manufacturer's setting is on our machine, okay? So I wanted to go over that with you, and this right here is your presser foot. Now, your presser foot I don't know if you can see it. Here's the middle right here. The distance between your needle and the edge of your presser foot should be 1/4 inch. A lot of the newer machines have what's called a 1/4 inch foot, so that that edge of that presser foot to the regular standard needle position is exactly 1/4 inch. So all you have to do is follow the edge of your presser foot. Now, depending on your machine, that may be a little different, okay? So what I suggest you do is make a couple little sample blocks, okay? And then get out your seam guide and measure your seam. Mine's exactly 1/4 inch because I'm using the edge of my foot pedal, okay? If your foot pedal is a little narrower or just a hair wider, you can still use the edge of your presser foot, but make sure within that project you stay consistent and use the same presser foot. And also keep in mind, your block, you may have to adjust a little bit to accommodate for that hair, because that hair, either a little short or a little wide in your seam allowance, can affect the finished size of your block. And we'll get into that more a little bit later. I have to tell you about my little adventure this morning. I think I've been up since about 3. I got out of bed about 3:30 to work on a WIP, work in progress. I'm working on getting my curtains finished for my sewing room here. So I'm sewing, and about 5 o'clock, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to make my coffee. So I go in the kitchen to make coffee and realize I'm out of creamer. Now, I don't use milk or cream in my coffee because the older I get, the more I can't tolerate a lot of dairy. So I've gotten used to using powdered creamer because that's what we have at work and that's what I use. So that's what I'm comfortable with now. Well, I ran out of the powdered creamer. And now it's 5:15, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Sunday morning at 5:15. Where am I going to get powdered creamer? So I do something that I never do. I put my shoes on, in my pajamas, and I'm driving to a gas station to buy a little bottle of creamers so I could have cream in my coffee this morning when I talk to you. Ridiculous, isn't it? What we do for our coffee, our morning beverage. So, I'm going to take a break and I'll meet you back here. And when we get back, we're going to talk about our 3 fabrics, how to choose color. We're going to talk about color value and contrast. More to come. Stay tuned. Hey, I'm back. So we've gotten through the beginning part of the video where I highlighted a little bit from part 1 of beginner basics. I went over some of the basic foundation information that you will need to prep yourself to get ready to sew. Now is the fun part. we get to pick out fabric. So now we have to talk about you and how you're going to choose color for this quilt, for your beginner basics quilt, okay? What I do is I start with what I call the focus fabric, meaning I pick one print that I like. Number one, I like the design of the print. And number two, I like the colors that are within that print, okay? So for example, when I'm going to demonstrate to you how to pick color is, I'm picking this focus fabric, okay? And then from there, I'm going to show you how to draw colors from that fabric to use in the second block, which is the 4-patch, okay? As a beginner, what I want you to focus on are 3 things. Number 1, contrast. What is contrast? Contrast is how one color stands out from another. My 4-patch that I showed you earlier. This has contrast because you can differentiate between this color and the white, okay? This has contrast because you can see the brightness of the red against the white. It has high contrast. My bed quilt I purchased at a thrift store. When I got it, I really liked how big it was, and I liked this fabric here, okay? So when I got it, I brought it home and I washed it and I laid it out on my bed. And it wasn't until a few weeks later that I realized this is an Ohio star. But I didn't realize it because the colors are so low in volume and have low contrast. This print and this print both have very low volume. Low volume is the amount of light or darkness there is in the color, okay? This is low volume and this is low volume. So when you put them next to each other, they have very low contrast. But look at the difference between this and this. These two have very high contrast because there's more black in the original color of this compared to the low volume. There's more white in this, okay? So these two have very high contrast. These two have very high contrast. These have very high contrast. These two have very low contrast, okay? So for the basic beginner quilter, when you have high contrast, the pattern shows up better. So if this quilter had used the brown in these star points here, you would have been really be able to see that star because there would have been high contrast, okay? So I want you to think about low volume prints, high volume prints, and contrast. Those are the important points you want to think about when choosing fabric. Okay. So this is our focus fabric. So I'm looking at different prints to go with it. And I pulled this purple. This purple has very low volume, so it doesn't do a lot for pulling out the purple within this print. However, let's look at this purple. This is higher in value compared to this. So you can see when I put this next to this, it pulls that purple out even more. So when this is going to be used in the quilt, you see more of the purple, okay? This has a higher value, okay? Now, let's look at, okay, this has an even higher value compared to this. It's darker. So this brings out more of the deeper purple tones within that flower, okay? We have light, medium, dark, okay? Light, medium, and dark. This is lower volume, this is medium volume, this is a higher volume, light, medium, dark. So what you want to think about is contrast and what I call the light, medium, dark. Okay, this is a lower volume, this is a medium volume, this is a higher volume. I like this medium volume. So that is a possibility to be used in my 4-patch. Now, the obvious other choice is pink. There's a lot of red tone in this fabric, okay? There's a red and there's 2 tones of red. Here's a lighter red, here's a darker red. There's a couple tones of pink, okay? And this one is sort of a marbled effect. This one has nice it complements this very well. So that's a possibility. And I also have a solid red that I could choose, which will work as well. Okay, so for my 4-patch for this, I can either choose the purple and the red, which I think would go well together, but the solid red isn't doing much for me. I don't know about you, but it's just not doing much for me. But this pink is. I think in the 4-patch, this pink and this purple will go well together. They're both medium in value, but they have enough contrast where you will be able to see the 4-patch well, okay? So that's what I want you to think about when you choose your fabric. How high of a contrast will you have? And how light, medium, or dark is the fabric, so that you can see the patches within the quilt. Now we get to start cutting. So I'm going to say 1 1/3 yard for the print, just so you have extra. You should have at least a 1/2 yard of each of the other 2 colors to make the 4-patch, but 1/2 yard, I would add, I might do 3/4 of each, just to be on the safe side, okay? So what we're gonna do is, we're gonna do our 4-patch first. Now, my fabric needs pressed, so always have your iron on, okay? You wanna hold your fabric up, like this. This edge right here at the top is the selvage, all right? Okay. This width right here, between selvage and selvage, right here, it's called width of fabric. This is 42 inches, okay? That width of fabric is very important because 42 inches is the standard width of fabric for quilt cotton. Now, when you hold it up, okay, do you see that ripple there? We don't want that, so we're going to shift our fingers a little bit until this lays smooth. Okay. We're going to lay it on our table. We're going to fold the selvage edge to the fold edge. And just like when we held it up, this has to be smooth. If we fold it and we go like this, and you start seeing that ripple, that means the grain line is off. It's askew. So you want to fold it up until there's no ripple, okay? Now, what is a grain line? Quilt cotton is made by interlocking threads, and they're woven sort of like a basket weave, one under the other, okay? Now, if it's laying flat and that weave, that's called a grain, is laying perpendicular to the cross grain, it's laying flat. If I fold this up and I get that ripple, that means the grain line is off. Let me show you. Let's see. If it's off grain, do you see it? The zigzag here? If it's off grain, this cut will not be perfectly straight, okay? I'm gonna line up this bottom fold right up with one of the lines on my grid. And I'm going to line up my ruler with this line and this line, okay? This is, I'm gonna line it up here and here, and I'm gonna take my cut. Okay, now I know that this and this are perpendicular to one another, so that when I make my cut at 4.5 inches, this is going to be straight. Now I want you to look at something, okay? Right here is the 4.5 inch mark right here. In between here is where my fabric is. I want my fabric to line up right along that dashed line. And that way I know I'm going to get 4.5 inches. Now, I also know that down here, it's perpendicular to this dashed line. As long as this marking is perpendicular, you can line it up here, you can line it up with the bottom of your ruler. But I want to show you these dashed lines, because in between the dashed lines, you see that fabric? It has to line up. We've lined up our ruler. We're ready, okay? If you are right-handed, your ruler is going to be held by your left hand. Your fabric is going to be extending off to the right. If you are left-handed, you're going to be holding the ruler with your right hand. Your fabric is going to be extending off to the left, okay? I'm right-handed. I'm putting my hand on top of the grid ruler like a spider. I'm holding it firmly. Now, there's something else I want to show you. Sometimes we need help gripping. This is a 2-pound weight. I got it at the thrift store. You can put this on your grid to help you hold that ruler in place. Pick up your rotary cutter and gauge the blade, okay? Hold it firmly. Start before the fold. Press firmly. Your feet are on the ground, shoulder widths apart. You're pressing firmly straight down. Engage the safety before you set it down. There is a straight cut, okay? Let's do it again. You don't have to follow the lines on your mat. Once you get it all lined up, you should be good. Use your weight, press firmly, and gauge the blade. Your feet should be shoulder width apart. You should have shoes on. If you're wearing sandals or doing this barefoot and you accidentally drop this and the blade is engaged, you will cut yourself. Please wear shoes. Please. I don't want anybody getting hurt, okay? 4.5 inches. Put your weight on. Hand in position. Engage your blade. Take your cut. Safety, set it down. I might get 4.5 this last cut. I might not. Yes, I did. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I need to figure out my measurements again to make sure I'm giving you the correct measurements. I need 3 strips cut at 4.5 inches. Okay, I cut 4 because I wanted to show you, demonstrate how to make your cuts. Okay, you need 3. I would do 4 because I always like having a little extra. It's just me. Here's the pink fabric. I want to line it up so you don't see ripples. Okay, this is a ripple. See it? Now we're going to line it up. We're going to lay it down and we're going to fold this up. No ripples. Okay, I'm going to take my first cut to even out this edge. So I'm going to line up the fabric with one of the lines on my mat. I'm going to line up my grid with one of the lines on my grid here and here, because I need to cut off this jagged edge. Hand in position. If you need your weight, put it there. Engage the blade. Press firmly and forward. Close the blade. Okay, now we're going to cut 3 strips at 4.5 inches where this fabric is lined up with that dashed line, okay? And this is perpendicular. So I'm going to engage my hand in the spider position, engage my blade. My feet are shoulder widths apart. I'm depressing firmly and moving forward and going slowly. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I have 3 strips in pink. I have 3 strips in purple. This has the selvage edge. We don't want the selvage edge. So we're going to cut off the selvage edge. That selvage is what they use to hold the threads together when they're creating the fabric. We don't want that. Now, I'm going to cut 4.5 inches square, and I'm going to cut one more at 4.5 inches square. Just cut 2. I want to show you something. Don't cut all of them, just cut 2. The basic way to sew a 4 patch is to put your 2 light colors on the diagonal and then the opposite colors on the diagonal. Okay, that creates your design. Okay, I'm going to put, there's the first column and the second column. I'm going to put the second column on top of the right column like this. I'm going to line them up. I'm going to put this under my presser foot. I'm going to hold on to my threads, because when I start, if I don't hold on to my threads, sometimes that top thread gets pulled down into your machine. It can cause a jam. So we're going to hold on to the top thread and the bobbin thread, and we're going to start. You do not have to backstitch, okay? In quilting, you do not have to backstitch, okay? So I'm following my fabric along the edge of my presser foot. Now, do you notice you don't see the fabric? That's because that edge is just on the inside of the presser foot, and that's where you want it. So I'm just going to stitch. Okay, this is called a stiletto. So is this. Mine are plastic. I got them from a craft store, like a Dollar Tree or a Dollar General. You know, they have a craft section. If you don't have one of these, You can use the end of a straw. You can use the end of a crochet hook. You can use a plastic butter knife, okay? Except the plastic butter knives they make today have that really sharp serrated edges. You'd have to sand that down a little bit because you don't want the serrated edges to snag your fabric. Anything to help you hold this fabric in place. Do you see that? So I'm just holding in place like this. Okay. Now before this fabric goes all the way through, I want to pick up my next two pieces like that, and I'm going to feed this piece underneath right behind the second piece, okay? This is called assembly line sewing. And assembly line sewing helps reduce the amount of thread you use, and it also is much quicker in getting your sewing done. Okay, let's open it up like this. Okay. Don't cut the thread right there. All right? Don't cut the thread. What we're going to do is, okay, I'm going to finger press this down. You can also use this. Turn it over. You can use this. Okay. I also have a plastic pie cutter, okay, that I can use to sort of keep that in place. Now, we're going to flip this over, and these two seams are going in opposite directions. That's seam allowance. This seam allowance is going to the right. This seam allowance is going to the left. And what that does is it creates a nice flat seam. That's called nesting seams. I'm going to hold my threads. Now I'm going to begin stitching. The stiletto helps keep those seams down in position so that those seams stay nested as you're stitching. Okay, let me open it up. See that? See how that seam is nested? Okay, now, pressing is different than ironing, okay? I already finger pressed these, but they should get pressed again, okay? So this is my most recent stitching line. I'm not pressing that yet, okay? What I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna hit those other seams real quick, okay? And now, before I press that last one, I'm gonna hit it real quick. That's called setting the seam. That heat helps set those stitches down into the fabric. Now, I'm going to sort of give it a little finger press. I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm lifting up my iron a little bit. It's called pressing. And the reason why we don't want to go like this in ironing is because you can end up distorting the block. That's one way of creating a 4-patch. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Now I'm going to show you the second way of creating a 4-patch. So the method I'm going to show you is a way to create multiple patches at a little bit faster speed. Okay, it's called strip piecing. We're going to take our purple, we're going to lay it on top. Okay, now you'll notice I didn't cut off the selvages. In strip piecing, we don't cut off the selvages until after we've sewn these together, okay? So what I'm going to do is, these are right side facing. What does right side facing mean? This is the right side of the fabric. this is the right side of fabric, and they're looking at each other. So when you put them together, it's sort of like they're kissing, right side facing one another, okay? We're gonna feed this into our machine, starting with our salvaged edge. We're gonna get it lined up, and we're gonna sew all the way down the strip, okay? You're gonna feed the fabrics under the presser foot, lining up the raw edge of the fabric with the edge of your presser foot, and you're going to keep that raw edge of the fabric just so that it's peeking underneath the presser foot. You're going to hold on to your top and bottom threads just for a few stitches when you get it started, and you're just going to sew all the way down the strip. I'm using 100% cotton thread in neutral colors. I believe I have white on the bottom and a medium gray on top. I tend to stick with neutral grays and neutral tans and beiges when I do my piecing. But this is a good opportunity to use up some of those half spools or partial spools of thread that you have left inside your thread box. Once the first strip is finished, feed through the next set of strips to continue your strip piecing. And what we're going to do is, before I open this up, it's one long strip, I'm going to press that seam, just hit it quickly, and what that does is the heat sets those stitches so that, let's say, one stitch might not be in alignment, or maybe it's a little looser. That heat sets those stitches so that they sit down into the fabric. Now, I'm starting in the middle, and I'm just going to finger press this, and I'm going to take the point of my iron and go like this. I'm lifting, and I'm going to take the point of my iron, and I'm going to push that seam toward that purple. Okay, this seam is going toward the purple. Now, in quilting, you press to the dark. That way, your seam does not show up in the lighter fabric, okay? So I want you to notice I'm doing an up and down motion, but I am sort of pushing that seam toward the purple to make sure it stays nice and flat, okay? And I have my steam on. Okay, are you with me so far? So we left off with pressing, and I showed you how to make one 4-patch block, and I also showed you how to do strip piecing, which is sewing long strips together with the intention of creating a block but doing it faster, okay? So now we have our strips, all right? What are we going to do with them now? We're going to cut them, and I'm going to show you how. With the strip piecing method, it allows you to make the blocks faster. So at this point, how do I know what size to cut this in order to put it together to create the block? Well, I know that this square has to finish at 4 inches, so I know it has to be cut at 4.5 inches. So does this strip. Well, first I'm gonna cut off this selvage. I'm taking off that first piece, okay, because that has a selvage. We don't want that. And I'm gonna cut 4.5 inches. My hand is in the spider position. I have my blade engaged. There it is. I'm going to set it aside. Cut my next one. I'm going to cut the whole strip at 4.5 inches. And as I take them off, I'm going to lay the next one right sides facing, because when I pick up this pile, they're all going to be ready to sew. Sometimes you get into a situation where as you're cutting, this edge gets a little askew. Why is that? Well, fabric moves, you know, and no matter how straight we press or how straight we sew, sometimes halfway through this strip, what you have to do is, I'm gonna cut a little bit beyond the 4.5 inch. I'm gonna line up that seam. I'm gonna take my cut, I'm gonna turn it over because I know that cut is straight. And I'm gonna line this up, and I'm gonna line up this. And I'm gonna make that nice and straight. Sometimes that happens. Okay, just make sure to stop and recut so that the rest of your sections are nice and lined up, okay? Assembly line sewing is very fast and effective when you are creating a lot of blocks. And in this particular quilt, we need 12 of the 4 patches and 13 of the large patches. Take them over to the iron. Okay, now, before I open up this seam, I'm gonna set the seam with heat just for a few seconds. And remember, what that does is, it sets those stitches into the fabric so that they're nice and snug. After you get all your blocks pressed, we're gonna measure them. And they should measure, if we had an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, it should measure, now this is cut, hasn't been sewn into the quilt yet. This should measure at 8.5 inches. I'm just a little shy on this edge. Okay, so let's measure the next one. That one's pretty good. That one's almost on the dot. Okay, let's do the next one. 8.5 inches. Okay, if they consistently measure almost right at the measurement that you need, then I know I need to cut the large alternating blocks at 8.5 inches, okay? If this block came out, let's say it came out at about 8.25 and 8.25, and you had several of them that came out consistently at around 8.25, then this block would be cut at 8.25, okay? You always want to do the block first in your quilt that has more pieces in it. That will determine the size of your secondary block that has less pieces in it, okay? Yeah. 1, there's 25 blocks. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're just going to keep going. I'm going to double check my notes, so I'm going to go off camera a minute. Well, that was a lot of information, okay, in part 2 of Beginner Basics, but I wanted to really give some foundation, all right, in which to build your journey. I wanted to make sure that I really gave you a good foundation for the explanations of the basics. And I also wanted to make sure that I took you through each of the steps slowly. From here, okay, part 3, when I have that video completed, part 3 is going to be all about how we sew these blocks together to make the quilt top, how we create putting the fabric together for the quilt back, how we layer the backing and the batting and the quilt top, how we baste those 3 layers together, and we're going to get started on machine quilting. Okay, so there's a lot to look forward to. I'm so excited that you're all starting on your journey for this wonderful world of quilting. My name's Angela Davis. Give it a thumbs up. Hope you enjoy it. And have a great day. And remember, why sleep when you can sew? Bye-bye now.